Okay. Well, I'm Jed H. Lyman. I've been asked to introduce Jed E. Lyman, and I talked to Jed's son, who is Jeremy, and he's the treasurer of the society. And so I've known Jeremy for a while. But what he told me about his dad is he worked his career in behavioral health and retired as a high school counselor at San Juan High. He's a descendant of Platt D'Alton Lyman, who was the de facto leader of the Hole in the Rock trek after Silas Smith went to Salt Lake, and you can correct me on those facts in your presentation. Jed has served as a bishop and a stake president and is currently their stake patriarch in San Juan Stake and works as a sealer in the Monticello Temple. And you and your wife have 7 children, 3 of whom still reside in Blanding, Utah with Jed, where he was born and raised. And the others are also in Utah, but not in Blanding. So I'll turn the time over to Jed and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. When Jed told me that he talked to Jeremy, I was a little nervous. He's not always to be trusted, but I guess he did okay this time. It's good to be with you, folks. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, thanks a lot. My wife was supposed to remind me to turn on that recorder, and my cousin was supposed to remind her, and neither of them did their job. And just for your information, Joanne is the official heckler today, so the rest of you don't need to do any heckling, because I think she will take care of that if I know her. But I'm pleased to be here. I heard someone up there talking to someone else, and they said, I dated your cousin. I didn't know she was my 3rd cousin. And I thought, oh, I dated my 3rd cousin too. She's now my wife. We both descend from Amasa Mason. And when I was dating her one time, I brought her to my parents' house for dinner on a Sunday afternoon. And my grandfather, Edward Lyman, was there. And he didn't say anything while we were there, but as soon as we left, he turned to my mom and said, what does that kid think he's doing? Doesn't he know they're cousins? He never said a word to me about it, though, so I guess it's okay. I don't know. But we do have 7 children. We have 24 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. And we feel very blessed to be in Blanding near a number of our grandchildren. As you're all aware, after the Saints settled Salt Lake, Brigham Young, the great colonizer, sent out settling parties all over the territory and into some of the surrounding what are now states, and was well known for his colonizing efforts. About the time that Brigham Young died in 1877, he had been talking about one area of Utah that had not been settled, and that was the southeast corner of what's now San Juan County. And but he died before he accomplished that goal, and it fell to John Taylor to accomplish that goal. And in 1878, he was instrumental in having about 60 families called from this area over here, Oak City and Parowan and Panguitch and Cedar City and other surrounding areas, to go settle the San Juan area. It turned out to be a little bit more of a challenge than some of them thought it might be, just to get there. And I suppose that's one of the reasons that it had not been settled to that point, because there was no easy way to get there. There were 2 known ways that they investigated to take the main party. One of them went south into Arizona, across the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry, up through the Navajo Nation, into southeast Utah. And they sent a party that way to investigate it. The Navajos said, well, I guess if you want to come, we'll let you. Although they weren't exactly welcoming them with open arms to cross their land. but they said, if you come, you cannot use our water, our wells. And so they decided, well, if we can't use their water, we can't cross that desert. So they came back up through what's now Blanding, Monticello, Moab, Green River, and across the old Spanish Trail, over to, the mountain back down to Cedar City area. And they concluded that way was too long and just wasn't compatible with what they needed. So they wanted to find a more direct route. And so what they concluded to do would be to gather at Escalante, which was recently settled. It's a couple of years earlier than this. This was in 1879 when they left, at the end of 1879. They gathered at Escalante and went southeast from there. Their first major challenge was crossing the Colorado River, and they knew that would be the case. They knew that there was a large river gorge they would have to negotiate. They'd have to get down the solid rock walls to the San Juan River, cross the Colorado River, cross the river, and then get back up out of the gorge. They had been told there was a crevice in the western side of the Colorado River gorge that might be suitable for a road, or they could make a road out of it. That became known as the hole in the rock, and because of that effort to get down through that hole in the rock, we oftentimes refer to these pioneers as the hole in the rock pioneers. They ended up eventually in Bluff, but from the hole in the rock to Bluff, they found out that the hole in the rock wasn't the only challenge. There were many, many challenges between the hole in the rock and Bluff, some of them probably equal in nature to the hole in the rock as far as difficulty. I want to begin by showing a brief video that will tell the story in pretty concise detail of the hole in the rock pioneers. So let me begin with that. As we conclude that, if you have questions, you'll be welcome to answer them. In fact, during this entire presentation, if you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to try and respond, make up something. So if we can make this technology work. All right, it's not working. What are we not doing right?
Put it on. Put it on. Go ahead.
How do I do that? Okay, still looking for this.
So we got to search for it. Where's Joe?
It was working. It's wild.
Where's Joe?
I'll look for him.
Stand by.
Like that, we'll go back in.
It came back after 3 months.
In 1870.
And it's combined with other ones.
So we use we ordered that right there.
And there's,
Yeah, it was working. We were working on your computer.
it's connected otherwise.
Ah.
In 1878, approximately 100 families from towns in southwestern and central Utah received church calls to settle the remote and uncharted area of the territory east of the Colorado River. Those able to accept these assignments sold farms, purchased wagons and teams, and bid farewell to loved ones as they began a journey of unparalleled difficulty.
It is the voice of the Lord to me to go, and I go with the help of the Almighty. Jens Nilsson.
Departing from their various hometowns in October 1879, the San Juan pioneers followed established routes to the last community along their way, Escalante. Just prior to reaching Escalante, the pioneers encountered their first challenge, the snow-capped Escalante Mountains. From Escalante, they began blazing a road through desert terrain. For the most part, the terrain initially encountered was flat and easily traversed. The Escalante Desert was flanked on the south by the towering cliffs of the Caparowitz Plateau, and on the north by the Escalante River Gorge. Into their journey, the San Juan pioneers reached 40 Mile Spring. They were now just 20 miles from the Colorado River Gorge. In reaching 40 Mile Spring, they were halfway to their destination. However, the feasibility of continuing was in question. Scouts gave a grim report of the terrain ahead. Prior to their departure, a southern route had been explored which crossed the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry and cut through the Navajo Nation. Sites for the settlement had been located, and the northern route along the Old Spanish Trail had been explored. But both of these routes were unacceptable. The Navajo leaders, including Chief Bastine, welcomed the Mormons as neighbors and encouraged road building, but told them that they could not use their springs. northern route was ruled out due to insufficient grazing for the company's 1,300 animals. Their chosen, more direct route had been explored up to a site on the Colorado River, where river currents and beaches were suitable to support a ferry operation. However, with their homes sold and winter approaching, the colonizers had to embark before this route could be fully explored. They expected some difficulty in crossing the Colorado River Gorge, but they did not anticipate such terribly broken terrain east of the river. Additional exploration of the area directly east of the river proved very disheartening. Terrain so rugged that their scouts described it as being unfit for even a bird to fly over. With no viable alternative routes and a desire to not abandon their mission, they unanimously agreed to continue.
We must go on whether we can or not. If we saints have plenty of stick to duty, we cannot fail.
The colonizers immediately pushed on over terrain that progressively worsened as they approached the river gorge. A crevice in the wall of the Colorado River Gorge they named the Hole in the Rock was the only feasible place to access the river. For 6 weeks, under frigid winter conditions, the pioneers filled depressions, cut down high spots, widened, drilled, and blasted a path down the crevice. Turning the crevice into a wagon road required ingenuity, skill, and determination. Near the bottom of the crevice, they literally attached their road on the side of the cliff. On January 26, 1880, the road down the crevice was completed.
It is about a mile from the top down to the river, and it is almost straight down. The cliffs on each side are 500 feet high, and there is just enough room for a wagon to go down. It nearly scared me to death.
The first 40 feet down, the wagon stood so straight in the air it was no desirable place to ride, and the channel was so narrow that barrels had to be removed from the sides of the wagon in order to pass through.
Down they went like a flash.
They went down like they would smash everything. I will never forget that day.
The women and children took hold of hands and slid down the first 40 feet as they could not walk.
I could hardly keep my feet under me. It was so steep and slick. Mommy, how will we get back home?
crossing of the 300-foot wide Colorado River was made possible by a large raft constructed by Charles Hall and many others from the town of Escalante.
I've been busy during the past 3 days moving the wagons up Cottonwood Hill, where it took 4 to 7 span of horses with the same number of oxen to move one wagon. Jed E Lyman.
Mother drove up the hill and tipped the wagon over. Baby was in the back, but wasn't home. But Mother was in a frenzy.
With the road blasted to the top of Cottonwood Hill, the pioneers were out of the river gorge and about to encounter some of the most rugged and broken terrain in North America. Building a road over what lay ahead would take another 12 weeks.
It's the roughest country you or anybody else ever saw. It's nothing in the world but rocks and holes, hills and hollows. The mountains are just one solid rock, as smooth as an apple. Elizabeth Decker.
The country is almost entirely solid sand rock, high hills, and mountains, cut all to pieces by deep gulches, which are in many places altogether impassable. It is certainly the worst country I ever saw. Jed E Lyman.
To descend from Gray Mesa, the pioneers blasted switchbacks down a cliff face they called Slick Rocks. Another substantial challenge was the descent down the 1,800-foot clay hills.
When we came to the top of the hill, they would detach their lead horses, and their young wife would drive them down while the husband brought down the wagon with one feet. Samuel Rowley.
The deep canyons of Grand Gulch required a northern detour to higher elevations, an area now called Cedar Mesa, where the solid sandstone gave way to other challenges.
The cedars are now thick all around us. There is a force of men ahead chopping all the time. There's a good deal of snow and mud making wheeling very heavy. Jed E Lyman.
To avoid the deep canyons and sheer cliffs that flanked the east side of Cedar Mesa, the pioneers turned south. As was the case at several other locations, the pioneers found a feasible route down from Cedar Mesa by following an ancient Anasazi Indian trail. The ancient trail led them along a narrow neck of land flanked on each side by deep canyons. The pioneers' final descent from Cedar Mesa was made by switchbacks they called the Twist. The San Juan pioneers now face their last major barrier, Comb Ridge. Following a wash at the base of Comb Ridge, the pioneers headed south toward the San Juan River, where the ridge had a more gradual slope. With equipment and teams completely worn out, their pull to the top of the ridge, called San Juan Hill, proved particularly difficult.
Here again, 7 span of horses were used. So that when some of the horses were on their knees, fighting to find a foothold, the still erect horses would plunge upward against the shoulder. To find most of the outfits for the cross, the worst stretchers could easily be identified by the dried blood and matted hair of the forelegs of the struggling teams.
On April 6, 1880, 12 miles beyond San Juan Hill, exhausted pioneers, animals, and worn-out wagons entered a valley flanked on the south by the San Juan River. A few families moved farther upstream to other designated sites, including Montezuma Fort, but most remained and immediately went to work at establishing the farming community they named Bluff. Sarah Williams, who was not a member of the Mormon faith, was persuaded to come along and help care for her
my sister's children. Imagine my surprise and indignation when about 6 miles from Cedar, I had the lines put into my hands and was told that this was my team of wagon to drive, an experience I had never before had. How thankful I was that I didn't have to make my home in such a place. I didn't see anything to stop for, nor could I see that it was possible to make a town in such a place. The unity among the people, coming out with no conveniences, and yet they were just as happy as they could be. Although we had put up with many inconveniences and unpleasant situations, I thoroughly enjoyed the trip and was deeply impressed with the love and actions of those with whom I traveled. Sarah Williams.
In reaching Bluff, the San Juan pioneers had succeeded in opening a supply and access road across the territory that greatly reduced future travel time over any other possible route. During their arduous 6-month journey, 2 babies were born, no lives had been lost, and they had become tempered for the challenges that lay ahead.
6 months in the midst of one of the severest winters. There was something more than human power or wisdom associated with it. Surely the hand of Providence had been over the traveling pilgrims. No serious accidents had befallen any of us. Human Jones.
Any comments or questions before we go on?
I think that movie is very well done because it's giving us a good shot of the sights.
It is. It's very well done. Lamont Crabtree, who makes the presentation tomorrow, I believe, is responsible for this movie. He's probably as knowledgeable as any man I know regarding the Hole in the Rock pioneers and what they went through. I have a lot of respect for him.
Is it available for sale?
It is. We have it at Bluff Fort. I gave out brochures. Before I get through, I want to be sure and talk a little bit about Bluff Fort. I saw a hand right back here.
When I was a young college student, David E. Miller apologized to me for not stressing the Lymans more in the book. And he's absolutely right.
Did I see a hand over here?
How many was the Hole in the Rock group?
There were about 260 people altogether, about 60 families roughly. Now, what I'd like to do for the remainder of the time is do what David Miller didn't do and talk about the Lymans. I love David Miller's book. I will never complain about his book. It's the best single documentary of the Hole in the Rock expedition there is.
Do you have a microphone?
Pardon?
Can you use a microphone?
They didn't give me one. I don't have one. I'm sorry.
Speak up a little louder.
I'll work on it. Here's just a couple of shots of the Hole in the Rock from Lake Powell. Now keep in mind, when they crossed it, Lake Powell didn't exist. The Colorado River was here, but now it's Lake Powell, so it's covered up part of the bottom of their trail. That's a little farther away shot. That's a close-up shot of the Hole in the Rock. My wife and I and several in here have been up and down that Hole in the Rock. How in the world they took wagons, I have no idea. I can't even imagine how they did that. This is looking from the top of the Hole in the Rock down. Again, I don't know how they got wagons down there. It's an amazing thing what they did. Where it was too steep, they would make steps to give the horses some footing. This is a shot of Uncle Ben's dugway. As you can see, there's no way to drive a wagon, so on the left side where those people are standing, they carved a track for the left wheel. They drilled holes in it, pounded big stakes in it, filled it in, and they had this road tacked on the side that somehow held up when they drove wagons across it. Okay, there were 7, as far as I know, of Amasa Mason's children who were involved in the Hole in the Rock effort to one degree or another. I don't have time to talk a lot about all of them. I want to tell you some stories about a few of them and some of the contributions they made, not only in getting to Bluff, but in surviving once they got there. These names are in order of their age. And if there are others, I haven't found a record of them. So I think this is all of his actual children who went. Yes?
Quick question, it may mention it in the documentary, but how long did it take them to actually blast and drill through that hole in the rock section?
They were there for 6 weeks.
Just for that section?
For that section. Now they thought when they left, it would take them 6 weeks to arrive in San Juan.
Yeah.
They spent 6 weeks just right there at the Hole in the Rock. And then it took them about 6 months total, the entire trek. Let me talk about Platt D. Lyman. He probably played one of the more significant roles. Plus, he happens to be my great-grandfather, so I can talk about him first. He made some major contributions. One of his major contributions was the fact that he was the assistant captain of the expedition. Silas Smith was called as the mission president. When they got to the Hole in the Rock, he realized that they were not going to be able to do this without some more equipment, especially blasting powder. And since he had been a member of the Utah Territorial Legislature for a number of years, Silas figured it was best for him to go make that appeal to the legislature and asked for funds. And so he left at the Hole in the Rock and went to Salt Lake. Went back across the mountain up to Salt Lake to ask for funding. He was able to get some funding and sent some blasting powder. But then he got sick and wasn't able to come back for a long time. And so it was up to Platt Lyman to lead the group. So his first contribution was he actually led the group from the Hole in the Rock all the way to Bluff. The second major contribution in my mind, and this might even be more significant, I don't know, was the fact that he kept an almost daily journal of their expedition. It's the only journal we have today that's written at the time on a consistent basis. There are other accounts that have been written, most of them years, some cases many years later. And there are a number of inconsistencies in those. Generally, people like David Miller and other historians who want to know what actually happened, they'll read Platt's journal because it was written at the time. There are many entries he made that I wish he would have added more. For example, on the day they finally went down through the hole in the rock, his journal says something like, "Today we went through the hole. We took 26 wagons down. We put them on the ferry, 2 at a time. The ferry was operated with 2 oars, and it worked pretty well." And I'm thinking, really? What about driving that wagon down there? What was that like? You know, one of the big questions that I have is who drove the first wagon? Who was the brave person or the something else person that did that? And there are several claims that have been made after the fact as to who did that. And I don't know. My wife and I, there's a version we like that has our 2 great-grandfathers teaming up and going down together. We vote for that one, but we don't know who did it. Another one that's probably the more popular, if you've read Undaunted, it's the one that Elder Lund uses. Joseph Nilsson had a pair of horses who had gotten pink eye on the trip, and they'd gone blind. When they got to the hole in the rock, they could not get any horses to go down there. The horses says, "Not me. I'm not going." And they tried several, and Joe Nilsson finally brought his up and says, "Mine will go." And they says, "What makes you think they'll go?" And he said, "Because they can't see what's down there." And he drove down, and the others followed. Now, I don't know which is the true story. We like the Cuman Jones, Benjamin Perkins one, but, you know, the Bartons happen to like that one. Did I say Joe Nilsson? Joseph Barton, I'm sorry. I said that wrong. Anyway, let's move on. There's another story I might tell you about Platt if we have time. Joseph Alvin Lyman, who was referred to as Uncle Jody or Jody, was a young man who was married at the time. I want to tell you a story about Jody Lyman that I think illustrates a couple of things. These people were asked to go settle San Juan really for a couple of reasons, probably more than 2, but 2 primary reasons. First of all, they wanted them to go make friends with the natives. There were Navajos, Utes, and Paiutes that all lived in that area. San Juan was kind of the flashpoint for those three tribes who clashed with each other. And so the prophet felt like we need to plunk a bunch of white people right in the middle of them as kind of a buffer between them and the rest of the settlements of Utah. And so, of course, they used the philosophy that Brigham Young had developed years earlier, which said, we'll feed them, not fight them. And it proved pretty successful. There were some clashes, but nothing that was too lasting. And so making friends with the natives was the first reason they went. The second reason was because the San Juan area was such a wild, difficult to get to place. It was lawless. There was no law there, and it was becoming a great place to hide out if you were hiding from the law. And so it's becoming inhabited somewhat by outlaws, and they felt like they needed to go claim it from those outlaws. So those are the 2 reasons. Now, this story that I'm going to tell you about Jody kind of illustrates both of those reasons, I think. About 1.5 years after they arrived in Bluff, 2 men rode into town. Don't know their names. One of them called himself Paxton. We don't know what his name might have been. But they came in heavily armed, they said. They wanted to trade horses. They wanted to trade their worn-out horses for someone else's fresh horses. And nobody in Bluff would talk to them about it. For some reason, they didn't want to trade these guys. Somebody uses his excuse, well, our horses are all out west of town out in Butler, so they're hard to get to. Well, that knowledge proved to be more valuable to these 2 men than a trade would have been, because they left, and a few days later, the townspeople realized all of our horses are gone. They're not out in Butler where we had them corralled and kept. There were 3 men who were asked to go follow. They assumed those men had, well, they looked for tracks. It had rained since the horses left, but they were eventually able to find the tracks heading west from Bluff. And so 3 men were asked to go find those horses. One of them was Jed E Lyman, Hiram Perkins, and Lem Red were asked to go follow until they get the horses back. Well, these men left. Their goal was to wait until the horses and the thieves reached the settlements, because they thought they could get some help and they could probably retrieve their horses without bloodshed. And so they weren't in any hurry to catch the horse thieves. However, the horse thieves would stop quite often when there was a good ambush site and lay ambush for these men who they knew were following them, or who they assumed were following them. The three men of the posse didn't actually find them until they got to the lake. At this point, they'd moved the ferry from Hole in the Rock upriver a few miles to Hall's Crossing, which turned out to be a better crossing, an easier crossing. And the Halls brothers moved their ferry up there and were operating Hall's Crossing. So the horse thieves got to Hall's Crossing, got their horses across before these three men came upon them. The three men came to the crossing at Hall's Crossing of the river. They crossed over, and then the account says that they were in no hurry to catch the horse thieves, so they stopped and played a game of jacks. Now, I have no idea what that means, because I can't imagine them playing the kind of jacks that come to my mind that we played or the girls played when I was a boy. You know, I don't know. You know, you grab those jacks and grab the ball. I can't see those men doing that, but they said they played a game of jacks. Maybe it's a card game. I don't know what it is. Anyway, so they were in no hurry, and then they saw where the horse had gone up one trail, the river, and so they took another route that looped around that trail, and they came down, and even though they didn't want to catch the horses and the thieves, they came upon all the horses who had been tethered and tied up, including not only their stolen horses, but the horses that were owned by the horse thieves. And so it's obvious the horse thieves brought them up there, placed them there, gone back and laid an ambush. So they thought, well, we'll just take the horses. They took them back the way they came, up around and down to the river, hoping that the horse thieves wouldn't hear or see them. Apparently the horse thieves did hear them. They began to come down, and they had two of the men who were left to watch for those horse thieves, while the other one, Hiram, and the two men, the two Halls brothers, would take the horses across on the raft. Anyway, I've got to shorten my stories. In the process, they finally got the horses all across the river, and just as they got to the other side, the horse thieves shot Jody in the leg, here in the upper leg, above his knee, shattering his femur bone into 1,000,000 pieces. They drug him up the riverbank to where the horse thieves couldn't see him, and the horse thieves continued to shoot at them, but they didn't hit anybody else. They waited there in the sun until dark, and then they took Jody, put him on a horse. He passed out immediately with the pain. They tied his leg to the cinch and headed away. In the meantime, the horse thieves called across the river, "Hey, let's have a conversation here and let's have a compromise." But the three men of the posse, the Halls brothers, they did talk to them, they just went away. They went about 5 or 6 miles, as far as Jody could stand it, and finally he says, "I can't go any further, you got to stop." So they stopped there. There was the ferry at that point was on the east side of the river. The thieves were on the west side, but there was a small boat, and their fear was that the horse thieves would cross in this small boat and come after them. It turned out they didn't do that, but they needed water where they were. They couldn't go on, they decided, with Jody. He simply couldn't stand it, and so I believe it was Hiram went to Bluff to get help as fast as he could go. And Lem Red stayed there with Jody along with the Halls brothers to try and take care of him. They needed water. The lake was about the river was about 5 or 6 miles away. They didn't dare go back there for water because the horse thieves might be there waiting for them. So they went to a place called Lake Gulch, where there was a little bit of a lake, and got water. But that was also about 5 or 6 miles, so it was a long way to go to get water each trip. In the meantime, some Navajos came who had befriended, who the pioneers had befriended. One of them's name was By Lily, and he asked them. They said something about needed to go get water, and the Navajo says, well, where do you get water? They says, over in the Lake Gulch country. And they says, oh, well, wait a minute. And they took a bucket, ran over the hill, came back in a few minutes with a bucket full of water. And there were some tanks, what they call tanks in the rock, where they will hold water. To this day, they're called Jody's tanks. Anyway, in the meantime, Hiram hightailed it to Bluff. On the way, he met some people who came back. They were going to the settlements. They came back. They had a nurse with them, actually, who helped one other thing I forgot to tell you about Lily and the Navajos. They says, what are you doing for this man's leg? And they says, we don't know what to do. We're picking out bone pieces, but that's all we can do. So he taught them how to take leaves of cactus and make a poultice out of it. They put that on, it began to draw the poison out, and it gave immediate relief to Jody. Not complete relief, but better. Anyways, so Hiram met this wagon, told him about him. He went on to Bluff. The wagon came back, picked up Jody. They, in the meantime, took a log and hollowed it out, all the way, all through the ends, made a splint, if you will, put him in the wagon and took him to Bluff. Jody survived. The rest of his life had a terrible limp. He was crippled pretty badly. They were pulling bone fragments out of that weeping wound for the rest of his life. John, is that where your wife gets her name? Jody, do you know? No. I wondered about that. Anyway, just one, yes.
My father was his grandson, and he tells a story of when he was little, really little, having to go down to where he had a cobbler shop at this point, I think it was, and they had to take a rag and they go through the leg and clean it out, all the infection out. He said that was one of his jobs when he was little. Wow. I can imagine.
No, I can't imagine what those people went through. Oh my gosh. Anyway, one little postscript to this story. As I mentioned, there was a boat left that they thought the thieves might cross the river. They didn't. They got in the boat and headed downstream. The boat eventually made it to Lee's Ferry, and Amasa Mason Jr. happened to be there at the time. Of course, he knew nothing about what had happened up at Hall's Crossing. And the history of San Juan County talks about Amasa Mason Jr. Befriending the man that ended up in the boat. And there was only one of the two horse thieves that made it when they got to Lee's Ferry. The other one was not there, although the one that was there had all the guns. We don't know what happened. Whether they had a fight, I don't know. Later on, that same man, who was one of these horse thieves, met up with another of the Lyman brothers up in Panguitch, and supposedly met up with another one in Salt Lake later on. And they didn't know anything about who he was, but they met him. But the final paragraph of this story in the San Juan history says this: as nearly as can be learned, he, speaking of this horse thief, is the man who afterwards was shot dead in a restaurant in Idaho, just as he deposited in his face a spoonful of hot potatoes. The whereabouts of that shot is not known. Someone in the killing business seems to have discovered that he needed killing and attended promptly to his needs. I love that. I don't know who wrote it, but I love it. Somebody's a pretty good writer to write that. Okay. So that was a little bit about Jody and what he went through. Walter Clisby Lyman, someone mentioned, is considered the founder of Blanding. As a young man, he went through, he was 16 years old when he came through the hole in the rock. When he was in Bluff, he went up onto what's called White Mesa, which is where Blanding is located, and fell in love with the place, absolutely fell in love with it. And he said while he was there, he had a very clear picture that there would be a community there one day that he would found. Over the next few years, he went up and actually surveyed. The problem with settling where he thought they should settle in Blanding was that there was no water. But up on the mountain, 15 miles to the north, there was good water. So he went up there using very crude instruments, surveyed a ditch from up there in the mountain down to Blanding. And his vision also included a tunnel through the mountain to bring water from the north side of the mountain. He was quite a visionary young man. Today, the water that we have in Blanding comes down through that tunnel that they drilled that he envisioned many years ago. And that's how Blanding gets his water today. He was quite a man. I'm quite impressed with Walter C. Lydia May. Lydia May came through as a 14-year-old girl. Her and her sister, Ida Evelyn, both came through. Ida was about 19, I think, and Lydia was 14. Just a quick story about her, and then we'll probably have to finish. She ended up marrying Cuman Jones. Cuman was married to one of a daughter of Jens Nielsen. Jens Nielsen was the man who, in the movie, said, "We must go on whether we can or not, and if we have enough sticky to tootie, we cannot fail." Anyway, Jens was married to his first wife. No, that's not true. Never mind. I'm not going to tell that story. I'm getting confused. His daughter, Lydia May, married Cuman. Cuman was married to Jens's other daughter named Mary before that. Mary was unable to have children, but she and Cuman were promised that if Cuman will take a second wife, then she'll be able to bear children. And so Cuman married Lydia May, and Mary ended up having a child, a son, named Leonard. Lydia May had 10 children, and in 1906, she was in her home in Bluff, carrying a baby. She was there with her 4 smallest children. The youngest is a baby in arms. She's holding the baby in one arm. She's holding a coal oil lamp in the other. And she was getting some bedclothes for her young children. In the process, somehow, the coal oil lamp was knocked off onto the back of her dress, which of course went up in flames immediately. She's holding the baby, has 3 other children there. Her first concern was for her children, not for herself. She made sure the children were safe. Her second concern was for her home. Finally, she realized that she needed to take care of herself. She ran out the back door to the well, jumped in a trough of water that was full, and put out the fire. By now, she had been burned severely. The nearest doctor was in Cortez, which was about 75 miles away. He was sent for. He came and did what he could for Lydia, put salve all over her, wrapped her in gauze or something, and then left instructions for Mary, Cuman's other wife, to take care of Lydia May, which Mary did as well as she possibly could. Lydia was would only allow one person to touch her or to care for her during this time, and that was Mary. After a few days, her condition deteriorated, and her son Tom was sent to Cortez to get the doctor. But mercifully, after 9 days, Lydia died and was relieved of the pain. Tom arrived back in Bluff as they were having the funeral for his mother. Mary, who had only been able to have one child, now had all of Lydia May's children to raise, and so she raised those children. The unsung heroes of the pioneers are the women. We hear a lot about the men. We hear relatively little about the women. They were amazing people, and I have such respect for them. I have such respect for all of these pioneers that it's difficult to even talk about them sometimes. All right, just two statements I'd like to share with you. This first one is by Ellen Larson Smith. She said, "My father, Mons Larson, declared always that the handcart journey in which he made the journey from Winter Quarters to Salt Lake was not nearly so hard as the journey through the hole in the rock." That's quite a statement to make. This last statement was made by Jens Nielsen, who was in the Willie Handcart Company, had his feet frozen, was unable to walk, was pulled by his wife the rest of the way, was rescued by the others at Martin's Cove, came to Salt Lake, was instrumental in settling Panguitch and Parowan and Paragona and Cedar, and I don't know, at least 5 places. And then he volunteered to come to Bluff as a 59-year-old man who had one foot that stuck out like this, and he walked with a severe limp. He said this: "As extreme as this handcart ordeal was, the trek through Hole in the Rock was more severe. Now, I don't know what he means by that, but I think that tells us that this was not an easy trek for those folks. 3 things that make this group unique in my mind. They weren't running from anything or looking for anything. They were simply answering the call of the prophet. They went from west to east, which was backwards for most of the pioneers that I've ever heard about. And no one died. In fact, because of the birth of 2 babies, their numbers grew on the way. I want to invite all of you to come to Bluff Fort. Bluff Fort is a recreation of where they settled there in Bluff. They established what they call Bluff Fort. They built their cabins in the form of a fort. And today that fort has been recreated. This is a recreation of a building the San Juan Cooperative Incorporated that they built in about 1895. It was destroyed in 1925 by a bank robber, by a robber who put some dynamite around the safe and blew it. And boy, did he blow it. He blew the safe, he blew the building, and of course he blew himself. So that was the end of him. But anyway, we invite you to come to Bluff Fort and see it's an amazing place. Many of you told me you've been there. Some of you have mission calls already. The church provides church service missionaries. So if you're looking for a really exciting, fun mission, this is the place, folks. This is the place. We love Bluff Fort. My wife and I volunteer there every week. I wish I could talk about what I'm showing you, but I don't have time. We use maps. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I want to bear my testimony that the church is true, that these people who came were only able to do what they did because of their faith in God. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Thank you.